Coming up today on LinkedIn News Live, can the investment community play a role in revitalizing the economy and widening corporate responsibility? We look at whether there's a case to be made for a more inclusive model of capitalism that puts the interests of employees, communities, and the environment on par with shareholder returns. That and our poll coming up. Hello, I'm Devin Banerjee, and welcome to LinkedIn News Live, where the business conversation begins with you. It's Wednesday, October 21st. Here's a quick look at the top stories professionals are talking about today. Walt Disney Company is unhappy with California. The state has released new COVID-19 protocols for theme parks to reopen, but Disneyland says the strict guidelines will only complicate the efforts. Disneyland California has been shut for 7 months, the longest stretch since it opened 65 years ago. And staying in California, the city of Compton is giving 800 of its poorest residents recurring cash payments of $300 to $600 over 2 years. It's part of a pilot program called the Compton Pledge, which also offers no-cost banking and access to financial counseling, all with the goal of helping people out of financial hardship. Meanwhile, CEO confidence is skyrocketing based on a new survey by the Conference Board. It's not a good sign for workers, however. CEOs are expecting to reduce capital budgets, slim down workforces, and keep wages largely stagnant. According to the report, 62% of CEOs say they're not worried about finding qualified employees. This is the first time since 2018 that CEO confidence reflects more positive sentiment than negative. For more stories like these, check out the news module to the right of your LinkedIn home feed, or if you're on mobile, click into the search box. And we've been polling professionals on the LinkedIn news page about the topic of today's show, and we want to hear from you as well. Are you more likely to invest in or buy shares of a company that embraces corporate responsibility? A, yes, absolutely. B, no, it's not a factor. Or C, it depends. Let us know in the stream. We'll come back to the results toward the end of today's show. And today we continue our coverage of this year's virtual Milken Institute Global Conference, which hosts conversations with the top business leaders around the world. And we're continuing that coverage by bringing you some of those guests right here on LinkedIn News Live. Today, we're discussing the future of capitalism with somebody who oversees the direction of more than $1 trillion in capital. Joining us now, fresh off of his virtual panel at the Milken Conference, is David Hunt. David is the CEO of PGIM, one of the world's largest investment firms with $1.4 trillion under management. David, welcome to the show.
Devin, it's nice to be with you again. Greetings.
It's always great to speak with you, David. Let's start with a high-level question about this topic. David, do you believe that capitalism, as it's defined now and as it's in place now, needs some reforming? And if so, how?
So, Devin, I really do believe that capitalism, at least as it's practiced now in the United States, does need reforming. And I think that the framing for that is really around the unequal outcomes that have occurred over the last 15 years. It's very clear that the system that we have in place now has done well for a relatively few, but not well enough for a broad range of Americans. I think it's important to say, though, that I don't believe that capitalism in its reforming should move to a more European socialist approach. I actually think that we need to keep the best of American ingenuity and flexibility and creativity. And so we need to find our own reform structure, which still uses the capital markets and still uses market forces to a very large degree. And so to your question, how does it need to be reformed? There are a couple of really important areas. I think that fundamental is actually making sure that our economy actually prices in the major externalities that we see around the globe. Climate change is probably the best example of that, but there are many others. Secondly, we need to increase the dynamism of our economy. We actually are creating fewer jobs. We have less growth, and we have industries that are more concentrated than we ever have before. And that dynamism is critical to creating opportunities. And last, and I think this is really important, we need to address the needs of people to have fundamental protections of a retirement plan, healthcare, life insurance, the ability to buy a home, and all of the things that during the 50s and 60s, the middle class in America had access to, but now 40% of Americans don't. And that is something we really need to tackle as a society.
Yeah, you've raised a lot of important topics. We're gonna drill down into some of those more specifically. Let's start, David, with the role of the investment community, of which you are a very prominent member, as I said in the intro, overseeing the direction of $1.4 trillion in capital. What role does a large, influential investment manager like PGIM have in affecting some of these changes?
Well, at least we feel that we have a great responsibility to help move society along on this. And that's a whole range of topics. First of all, we are in a privileged position to really try to drive for more transparency from companies around some of these topics. We have a role in insisting on companies to actually disclose their carbon footprint, for example. We have a really important role in asking companies how they're investing in their communities. So transparency is an important part of it. Secondly, we actually, as owners, both stock and bond owners, we have a role in engaging management about what they're doing and how they're thinking about some of these societal forces as they manage their business. But I think real active engagement is one of the most important things that an active manager can provide, and is something that passive managers really can't. And then last, I think that we have a responsibility to continue to develop products which allow both institutions and individuals to express their own view of what's important in society in how they invest. So some people will want to invest in companies which have lower carbon footprints. Others will care much more about having a portfolio that actually eliminates tobacco and guns. And we can have a whole range of types of products that actually allow people to express their beliefs about these in the capital markets. So all of those, I think, are part of the responsibility that we feel.
I want to take a moment, David, to say hi to some members joining us in the stream today. Phil from St. Louis, Dolores from Dallas, Andrea from Florida, Martha from LA, and Matthew from Vermont. Thank you so much for joining us. Remember to pose questions in the stream, and I will pose some of those to David in a couple minutes. David, let's drill down a little bit into a process that you're describing called ESG investing. And for those viewers who aren't familiar with this is a process of incorporating environmental factors in the investment process, social factors, corporate governance factors into the investment process. David, let's hear from you how PGIM approaches ESG investing and incorporates those factors into your own investment process.
Sure. Well, I'd first say, Devin, that the incorporation of ESG is, while somewhat newer in the United States, it really isn't around the world. Europe has led the way in this for a long time, and because we manage a lot of money for European pension funds, we've been doing this for quite a while. But what we believe in as an active manager is that we actually have a fiduciary duty to look at those ESG factors and to actually specifically take them into account and embed them in our investment process. So for every bond that we own, we actually give them an ESG rating. In our quantitative equity business, we develop a weighted methodology for actually evaluating how well an individual company and therefore stock does on ESG measures. And then we can use those weightings to actually develop differentiated products. So for us, we believe that ESG should be a part of every investment decision, and we believe that it should be absolutely embedded in the investment process, not an overlay or some afterthought that's done once decisions have already been made.
Right. David, another big picture topic that I know you have been speaking about recently is globalization and what this pandemic has taught us about our globalized, interconnected system of business and of trade. And as the end of capitalism is sometimes predicted, so is the demise of globalization. Do you think the pandemic is signaling a demise of that globalized, interconnected system of business and trade?
So I don't buy the what's become almost now popular argument to declare the death of globalization. But I do think we're at a real inflection point, and I think globalization over the next 10 years will look very different, partly because of the pandemic and partly because of technology forces than it has. Maybe most prominently, over the last 10 years, banks have really pulled back from their international lending portfolios. And FDI has also, the foreign direct investment has also declined. And that's meant that the number one way that savings and investments are intermediated globally is through the securities markets. And that is a very big change from the past. And it certainly puts a lot of responsibility on investment managers such as ourselves to truly act as global citizens. Secondly, I would say that people are rediscovering that their supply chains were way too concentrated. And that was particularly true for China, but others as well. And so you're seeing companies become much more dispersed in terms of how they're sourcing goods. And you'll see that continue to involve many more countries than supply chains did before. And then last is the role of technology. So technology really is starting to enable the fact that services now can be part of globalization. Historically, globalization has mostly been about the trade of goods. But now, whether you think about law firms or architectural firms or having your X-ray read by a doctor in India, those are all now perfectly possible. And you'll start to see services now become more global. So globalization is not going to die, but it is going to look pretty different than it did 10 years ago.
Interesting. And I just want to give a shout out to Vapin in our stream, who says, money making should not be the sole goal of an enterprise, but should include social, environmental, and human benefits as well. David, I want to pose a question to you coming from our audience. Eddie asks, as you said, David, the role of the capital markets is important in all of these issues that you're mentioning. But what is the role of government regulation of those capital markets? How do you see regulation right now? And how do you think regulation could help us with some of these big picture issues that we're discussing?
Right. Well, I think one of the reasons you've seen companies step up and become more involved in the kind of stakeholder capitalism and more formally recognize the role that communities and employees play in their proposition is actually because we've had a failure of government. I believe that government has really not stepped up to what is needed in terms of making sure that markets run efficiently. And the two biggest ones I would point to are, one, a real failure to price in externalities. The market will react to the prices that it has. And the government has been remarkably slow in its ability to decide that it is going to price in some of the major ones we know, like pollution. Secondly, and I think quite importantly, has been the role of antitrust. We have a whole new world out there now based on a platform approach to economics. And that's where the old economic model doesn't work. And yet we haven't reinvented our thinking around antitrust and how that should be used. Our economies, not just technology, but our industries broadly, are more concentrated now than they've ever been. And we need that American innovation spirit. We need creative destruction to be much more a part of our economy. And to do that, we will need a reimagined antitrust approach from the government.
Interesting. David, let's focus in a bit more on the US now. As you said a couple minutes ago, here in the US, because of this pandemic and during this pandemic, we're experiencing what some economists are calling a K-shaped recovery, where those who are doing well pre-pandemic are doing fine, perhaps even better, and those who are struggling are in even more dire straits. What are the implications of this trend, do you think, for fiscal policymakers and for monetary policymakers?
Well, I think it's a really important point, Devin. I mean, we unfortunately we learned during the last financial crisis how central banks could come in and really help markets. And this time around, we applied that technology, but we also expanded and made it even more powerful. And in fact, I would say the government's done an excellent job, and central banks have done an excellent job for markets. We haven't done as good job for Main Street, and I think that is what is really required now. We need to get more cash in the hands of small business owners and individuals in order for us to get this through this for the next 9 to 12 months. And I really do believe that the core answer to that does lie in another stimulus package, and one that is importantly aimed at getting money into the hands of small businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. David, another issue that I know you care very deeply about is retirement security. Some of our data here at LinkedIn from our LinkedIn Workforce Confidence Index has shown that among the areas where those who are financially stressed during this pandemic have been cutting back is unfortunately in some contributions to their retirement savings. This month, as you know, David, is National Retirement Security Month in the US. What do you think viewers should keep in mind when thinking right now specifically about saving and investing for their long-term retirement?
Well, I'm really glad you raised that, and I think it is one of the most important issues that we face. I think there's a couple of real headwinds for retirement savings. One is obviously that interest rates are very low. And so even as people begin to cut back, the return that they're getting on many of their investments is also low. And so you actually need to put aside more rather than less in the environment that we're in. But to be honest, the bigger problem for America is not those people who have a plan, and that's largely the kinds of people who fill out these surveys. The problem we have is that 40 million Americans do not actually have access to a retirement plan. And we need a cheap and cheerful way of providing low-cost retirement plans to small businesses and to individual contractors, like a personal pension, so that they're able to start early and save regularly, which are the real keys to retirement savings.
Yeah, absolutely. So, David, I want to talk a little bit about the investment management industry. Sure. and the investment management process. We have a question from Harold in the stream who's asking, what's the impact of technology innovation been on your industry, on your investment process? This is something you and I spoke about just a few months ago.
Yeah, we did, and I think it's really one of the most interesting areas. It's amazing the range now of data that we can use to evaluate an investment. So it used to be that there was you had your Bloomberg machine and there was publicly available information from companies, and that's mostly what you used. But imagine now we can buy satellite imagery of foot traffic in front of an office building. We can buy location data, which shows us where people are moving to and from and how frequently they're moving. We can actually see the shopping traffic in malls. So our ability to invest using lots of new and interesting data sources has grown dramatically in the last 5 years, and I think it will continue to skyrocket. And the big question is, can we get better and better at data analytics so that we can use that data in ways that actually make better investment decisions? But we think we can, and we're certainly investing behind it.
And are there implications of this trend on the kind of talent you look for when you are hiring and PGIM is hiring? Does the skill sets that you look for, has that looked different recently than it has earlier in your career?
Well, we certainly have more people that come to us with an engineering, technology, data science background, without a doubt, because those are certainly growing areas. But I would also say the biggest change is that, it used to be that technology was something that you had a technology department for, and real senior managers didn't worry themselves about things like that. It was kind of we need a low cost effective service. And instead, technology has now moved to where it's actually the competitive weapon and strategically important. And so senior managers also now need to really understand technology trends, and how it can transform their business in ways that they really didn't 10 years ago.
And David, final question for you on the topic that we started this show with, on reforming capitalism and those reforms that you yourself said are necessary. Do you think this pandemic has helped that process or set us back in that process?
Well, I think probably both, and here's what I mean by that. My biggest fear coming out of the pandemic is that we will have even greater inequality than we had before, and that we won't be as successful in getting some of these programs through to small businesses and individuals. My optimistic part of me thinks that that should spark a bit of a backlash, and that hopefully we can use the energy from that to actually get some of the major reforms I talked about before done. In particular, reforms which would allow the provision of retirement, health care, and other benefits to the vast number of American workers. That is the single biggest thing I think we need to do for our economy, and also for beginning to get at the issues of inequality.
Well, David, a very important conversation and some great actionable takeaways from you for policymakers, for executives, for investors. I want to thank you for joining us today.
Thanks very much for having me, Devin. Nice to be with you.
That was David Hunt, CEO of PGIM. Now, earlier in the show, we asked you, are you more likely to invest in or buy shares of a company that embraces corporate responsibility? Let's take a look at the results of that poll now. Looks like about 64% of you, about 2/3, are weighing in with yes, absolutely, including Kathy, Robert, Barbara, Justin, Daphne, Dolores, all saying yes. For me, it would make a difference if I was not sure about an organization and you were researching an organization, you would care about their corporate responsibility. About a quarter of you, including Liliana and Michael, say no, it's not a factor. And about 1/10 of you say it depends. Andrea says it depends if a corporation is growing and can demonstrate true action that is visible and tangible, then I would be more likely to invest in that company. I want to thank all of them and you, the viewers, for joining us today. Remember to join us tomorrow on LinkedIn News Live, when my colleague Caroline Fairchild will be sitting down with the authors of a new book that explores how certain words that we use in the workplace can reinforce gender biases and what we can do to avoid them. I'm Devin Banerjee. Thank you again for joining us on LinkedIn News Live.